Okay, gents. So every year, our paper two results at the school are probably our worst, and it's the same around the country, to be fair. So the reason why is because it's a very, very heavy knowledge paper. You have the Cold War and Anglo-Saxon, and a lot of people just forget the basics of certain topics. So in addition to the walk and talking mocks for paper 1, 2 and 3 this year, I thought I'd record a little video on just the very bare basics of Cold War, and I'll do a separate one on the Anglo-Saxons. This is not everything, so please do not think this will be all of your revision, but I will cover every single topic in the specification in a very small amount of detail. But this could be the kind of thing that you watch in parts. You might want to watch part 1, part 2 and part 3. Divide it up, watch a little bit, take some notes, but hopefully if you watch this, you are covered for anything that comes up. So the course begins with three war conferences: Tehran, Yalta and Potsdam. The way I teach this is I want you to think of them as war conferences. So look at the dates that they are in. Tehran is in 43, Yalta is in Feb 45 and Potsdam is in July 45, and Germany surrenders in April of 45. And if you remember that, it's quite easy to remember what they're going to be discussing. So at Tehran, Germany are yet to be defeated. So they're going to be discussing, how do you defeat Germany? And well, one of the main ways they do that is the USA agreed to open a second front, which means they are going to launch D-Day. So it's the precursor to D-Day. Whereas by Yalta, Germany is basically very, very nearly defeated. So with Germany on the verge of defeat, they're now going to be talking about what do we do with Germany? And they agree to divide Germany up into 4 zones. But Germany's not yet been defeated. They also start to think about, well, once the war is over, what are we going to do about Europe? And Stalin starts to disagree about the idea of free elections. Him and Roosevelt were still getting on pretty well. By Potsdam, everything's changed because Germany have now been defeated. Truman has replaced Roosevelt. Churchill is gone and Attlee is in. Stalin is still there though. So now Germany have been defeated. It's now formal that Germany are divided up into 4 zones: USA, UK, Britain and France. And also in July, America tells the Russians that they have developed an atomic bomb and they're about to drop it onto Japan. So Stalin is very angry. So the tensions throughout these meetings get worse. And the reason why the tensions get worse is because they're competing against a common enemy here. But at these 2 meetings, the enemy is nearly defeated and is defeated. So they start to disagree more and more. Why do they start disagreeing? Well, this is where the Cold War is a nice story. You want to try and remember this as a story. That's why I've done this like a timeline. The reason why is because the USA is a capitalist country. By capitalism, we mean they have private businesses. Things are not state-owned, so you can go into a shop and buy private goods. That means we have elections for a president, for a leader, whereas a communist, everything is state-owned. So railways, for example, all owned by the government. This means they have less individual freedom, but as a collective, they're more equal. They do not have elections. These 2 sides are polar opposite. So the reason why they can't get along is because they are basically following completely different ideologies. That starts all of the tension, basically, and then things kick up another gear when Truman does indeed drop the atomic bomb. So there are 2 atomic bombs dropped in 1945. You have one on Hiroshima, one on Nagasaki. And Stalin is very annoyed about this because he was only told about it at Potsdam. Then you get these 2 weird topics that everyone always forgets. They're really easy. So there are 2 telegrams sent, the long telegram and the Novikov telegram, both in 1946, and they create tension. So the long telegram, if I do that one first, there is a guy, I can't remember his name, George Kennan, who writes this. He is the USA ambassador. That means that he's the USA ambassador for the Soviet Union. So he's from America, but he lives in the Soviet Union and he helps strike sort of trade deals, etc., etc. He writes back to America and says, based on what I'm hearing, the USSR is very aggressive. So he writes back to the USA and he says things like the USSR is aggressive and we need to be ready to fight to stop them. So it creates tension. And the Novikov telegram is literally the exact same. This time you get the USSR ambassador who lives in America. He sends his message back to the Soviet Union and he says that the USA are trying for world domination, and that the Soviet Union are the only side that can stop them. So basically what these telegrams do is the American one says the Russians are evil, the Russian one says the Americans are evil, and they create tension. This combined that same year with the Soviets taking over their satellite states in Eastern Europe, because think geographically, when they win the war, they get to Germany by going through the east. So imagine Germany is here, the USSR is here. The Soviet Union get to Germany by going through countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, and as they go through them, they take them over. And then they're meant to give them free elections, as discussed here, but Stalin obviously doesn't do that. So they start illegally basically taking over some military dictatorships. So we see places like Poland in 1947 become a Soviet satellite state, and then we see Czechoslovakia and Hungary also become Soviet satellite states in 48. And again, not too difficult to guess what this does. It increases tension. So tension goes up, and now the Americans have to respond to these Soviet satellite states. Well, how do they respond? They respond by not fighting Eastern Europe. They respond by basically solidifying Western Europe. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, both in 1947. And the US say, right, you've taken over your countries in Eastern Europe, but you're not allowed any more. And the US starts funding countries in the Truman Doctrine, Greece and Turkey. They receive a total of about $400 million so they can fight against communism. This is the idea of containment. You are going to not stop communism, but you will contain the spread of it. Now, in order to tell countries like Greece, Turkey, France, don't go to communism, they're going to want something out of it. So George Marshall comes up with an idea called the Marshall Plan, where they basically give $13 billion to rebuild things like hospitals, schools, etc., because this is a war-torn area. Remember, Germany had been fighting in Europe for 6 years, so Europe looks pretty bleak. They spend their money to rebuild their country, and it increases the division, because now you've got Eastern satellite states run by the Russians, and basically, although Western Europe are not satellite states, they're sort of controlled by America economically, because they have America to thank. The fact they can rebuild their schools and their hospitals is because of America. So you get this really big division already, only 2 years after the war. There's this massive division between East and West. And that division basically keeps going on throughout the Cold War. We get to two topics here that everyone hates, and I have quite an easy way of teaching this. So the way the Cold War works is often when one side does something, the other side has to respond. The Soviets can't just allow the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan and they not to have a response. So the Soviets respond by something called Cominform and Comecon in 1947 and 1949. Now, the way I teach this, it sounds a bit silly, but Truman Doctrine is a political event, shall we say. Cominform has an I in it, so I always remember it is in response to the Truman Doctrine. Response to the Truman Doctrine. Therefore, it's a political thing, so it does things like coordinating the parties into one big group. It's the idea of making sure they are all on the same page, they're all streamlined. In response to the Marshall Plan is economic, an E in it. So in response to the Marshall Plan, we get Comecon, and that's how I remember the two. Comecon is Marshall Plan, economic. Cominform is political. These are a little bit of nonsense, to be honest, but they're on the course, so you have to know them. Comecon, what it does is it says economic aid for the Eastern Bloc, so it's meant to be a bit like the Marshall Plan, but the Soviets haven't got 13 billion pounds lying around or whatever. So what they actually do is they try to share resources together. So if one country produces one resource really well, they'll share the resources around the Eastern Bloc. Let's be honest, it's nowhere near as good as the Marshall Plan. It has NATO being formed here, but I'm actually going to scrap this. NATO, I'm going to put under here. So, remember, we go back, it's a story, Yalta and Potsdam. The Berlin is divided up into 4. The problem is, it sounds fair, but if you imagine this is, I'm just going to draw a random map of Berlin. You imagine it's divided up into 4. Let's imagine this is the Eastern Zone here. Berlin is in the Eastern Zone. Now, Berlin is also divided up into 4. But the Russians are not happy about this. So the first crisis occurs. the Berlin crisis. We call this Berlin Crisis 1. It begins in 48, but it goes on to 49. The USSR blockades West Berlin, and the USA respond with the Berlin airlift. The blockade begins on June the 24th. They blockade air. Sorry, they don't blockade air. Ignore that. They blockade road, rail, and canal because this is legal, but you can't blockade the air. You cannot shoot down planes. So America makes a huge decision to fly stuff into West Berlin to prevent these people from starving to death because they cannot get any goods into their zones. They start it on June the 28th, and it lasts for 11 months until May the 12th. In that time, they drop over 2 million tons of supplies and resources. Stalin cancels the blockade on May the 12th because basically he's looking like a moron. Stalin, as a response to this, looks very cruel. The West Berliners do not like him. Truman, on the other hand, looks like an absolute legend, a hero. He has saved the people of Berlin. They then decide to combine their zones even further. And there is a little bit here before this, but remember, I'm only doing the basics here. And they call it West and East Germany. Federal Republic of Germany and German Democratic Republic. Really annoyingly, the one with democratic in it is a lie because it's the East. But just remember West and East Germany. Don't really worry about these two. This sparks an arms race. Both sides see how close they could get to war, so they start to build up their nuclear arsenal more. And I should have mentioned this, America also creates NATO, which I mentioned I was going to drag down from here, because they're worried about a potential attack in Berlin. NATO is a defensive alliance full of Western European countries like Britain, France, West Germany. The arms race begins, and the USSR does not yet have a nuclear weapon until 1949. The USSR now has their own atomic bomb. And from this point onwards, it's not about getting a nuclear weapon, it's about getting the most and how quickly we can do it. In 1952, the USA develops a hydrogen bomb, which is more powerful. And you guessed it, the following year, the USSR do the same. Then they're trying to compete for ICBMs, and they both create ICBMs in 1957. Both sides, intercontinental ballistic missiles, create ICBMs. And this is the idea that the arms race is spreading further and further. The Russians or the Soviets start panicking. America's got a defensive alliance. We're both building up weapons. We haven't got one. So the Warsaw Pact begins. And the Warsaw Pact is 1955. And once again, this really, really clearly divides the East and the West of Europe. It's not a good place for the world to be in. Because if you think big picture, you've now got Europe. If you imagine Europe as a circle, you have got West and East. They are completely divided. You have capitalists, you have communists, you have satellite states, and you have Marshall Plan. There is a huge amount of division between West and East, and it looks like this division will eventually erupt in warfare. Then we get our second major uprising. Stalin actually dies in 1953, and he's replaced eventually by Khrushchev. And Khrushchev actually says some pretty nasty things about Stalin. He speaks about de-Stalinization, the idea that Stalin was actually pretty unpopular after his death. No surprise with what he did during his time in power. So Khrushchev says, maybe we will change the way the Soviets do things. Hungary hears this and think, does that mean we can be free? We haven't got to be a satellite state. So they start to protest against the Soviets. They actually start protesting by tearing down a statue of Stalin, which again shows you this idea that they think they might be able to be free because Stalin is no longer in charge. Khrushchev, the new leader, has a difficult decision to make. How does he handle this first violent uprising? Well, he actually puts, to try and stop the rebellion, he puts someone called Imre Nagy in power as the new leader of Hungary. And he's meant to be a popular leader that will help to reform. The problem is that Imre Nagy goes one step too far. And he says that Hungary are going to leave the Warsaw Pact. Khrushchev now has a decision. If he lets Hungary leave the Warsaw Pact, the other countries in the Soviet satellite states in the Eastern Bloc are also going to want to leave. So Khrushchev decides to crush the rebellion. He sends in about 6,000 tanks. He sends in about 200,000 troops. He kills Imre Nagy and he ends the rebellion. There is quite a lot of refugees out of this. There is about 3,000 to 20,000 Hungarians that are actually killed because they do fight back. It's quite a brutal event, shall we say. About 200,000 flee as refugees as well. It's quite a big event. America, though, does nothing because containment says they get involved in countries that are not communist. Hungary is already communist. And if they intervene, they could go to nuclear war, and they do not want war. So Hungary boils over, doesn't result in huge warfare. But it is a big moment for tension, and it symbolises the Soviets controlling their Eastern Bloc. That is topic 1. It's the biggest topic by a mile. So if you want to pause the video and come back to topic 2 another time, I would recommend that. I'm obviously going to keep whizzing through it. Topic 2 has 3 major topics. 3 major topics only, which is quite nice. Berlin, Cuba, and Czechoslovakia. So we'll start with Berlin. The Berlin problem has still not been solved. It is still the situation where Berlin is still, like we said earlier, in the Eastern Zone. They have a bigger problem as well. The East Germans are fleeing, the refugee problem, sorry. People are leaving East Berlin, and they are fleeing to the west of Berlin. This makes East Berlin, the communist side, look rubbish. We call this the brain drain because the kind of people that leave are your young, intelligent, academic people. And from about 49 to 61, about 3.5 million people leave. That's a real problem. The Soviets are looking weak. So they have a number of different things to try to solve this problem. The first one is Khrushchev issues an ultimatum to Eisenhower, and he says you've got 6 months to get out or war could happen. Eisenhower basically laughs and says, no, I'm not getting out. Then you have some summit meetings. So there are 2 at the start, which are not the most important, so don't worry too much if you don't know them. But we have Camp David and we have Geneva. These are these lovely meetings. The 2 sides meet to try to solve something, but nothing really happens. Then you get the big 2. In 1960, they meet at Paris, but they don't meet at Paris. They are supposed to meet at Paris, but a spy plane, a U-2 spy plane, is shot down. Eisenhower refuses to accept that they are spying on the Soviets. The Soviets know they are because the pilot admits it, but Eisenhower refuses, and the meeting is off. Kennedy is a new president, and in Vienna of 61, he meets Khrushchev, and Khrushchev is very brutal to him, and he says basically, we're going to go to war, you need to back out of Berlin. He tries to bully Kennedy, and this results in massive tension and really, really sparks the arms race as both sides prepare for war over Berlin. Is of course, war does not happen because a Berlin Wall is built. The Berlin Wall stops the brain drain. It actually reduces tension because it stops war breaking out. And in the end, both sides are happy. America managed to keep a part of Berlin, and the Russians stop the brain drain. So in a weird way, everyone is happy except, the German people in Berlin who can't visit their family on the other side. The wall was built in August. It's about 43 kilometers total, and it actually calms things down. Kennedy does visit West Berlin. He's praised. The US say they're not giving up on Berlin, but in reality, the wall stays there until the end of the Cold War. No one ever solves the problem, and Germany just has to deal with it. That's topic 1. Topic 2 is Cuba. Cuba is nicely put into 3 topics: Cuban Revolution, Bay of Pigs, and Cuban Missile Crisis. It's a nice, easy 1, 2, 3. It's a nice, easy story. The story begins in 1959 when a socialist leader called Fidel Castro removes Batista as part of a Cuban revolution. The Americans really like Batista because he allows them to control Cuban industries. However, Batista's a bit of an idiot, a dictator. The Cubans do not like him. What happens is America refused to accept Castro, and they stop buying the Cuban sugar. Sounds a bit silly, but Cuba makes a lot of money exporting their sugar to America. Castro says to the Soviets, will you step in? And the USSR start buying the sugar instead. Then what happens is America needs to get rid of them. So they launch a Bay of Pigs in April to try to remove Castro, and it is a disaster. They send 1,500 Cuban exiles to try and start a popular revolution. It's a complete calamity. Kennedy doesn't even send air support. The whole world knows it's America, even though they're pretending it's not America. There is nothing they can do because the people of Cuba like Castro. They don't like Batista, and America don't understand that communists can be popular. Khrushchev and Castro start to panic, though. Castro starts to think, what if they actually take us over again? They properly invade. And because of that, because of the invasion, the Soviets send more support to Cuba, and this time they send missiles. And these missiles are spotted on the 14th of October by spy planes, and that sparks a Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis is essentially the 16th to the 27th. I'm not going to go into great detail here because I do it in the Walking Talking Mock, but I split it into 2 weeks. Week 1 is how do you make a decision, and they end up coming to the decision, which is the blockade. Week 2 is the actual, so we said the blockade taking part. In the end, the problem is solved by a letter. Khrushchev sends 2 letters, and if you watch the other video, I go into a lot more detail on this, but the eventual end is America secretly removes their missiles from Turkey 6 months later and promises not to invade Cuba, and the Soviets take out their missiles. This actually heavily decreases tension. The 2 sides see how close they are to war, and they don't want to do this again. It's the closest we ever come to nuclear war. So they do things like install a hotline in 1963. They pass a test ban treaty to stop testing in outer space. And then they also pass some other treaties down here to basically try to get on better terms. Final crisis is Czechoslovakia. If you remember what we did earlier with Hungary, Czechoslovakia is very similar. They're unhappy because they want more reforms. They are not happy with how they live under the Soviet government. So it's very similar to Hungary. But think back to Hungary. Imre Nagy was put in power, and he said he's going to leave the Warsaw Pact. So in Czechoslovakia, they also have a new leader in place called Dubček, and he is going to pass reforms. It's called the Prague Spring because it happens in Czechoslovakia, the capital Prague, in April, the spring. These reforms are meant to be things like more freedom. So freedom of speech, freedom of press. What he calls it, quite a nice phrase, he says he's not a communist, he's a socialist, but same thing basically in this course. He calls it socialism with a human face, which basically means he's not a nasty man, he's a nice guy. He's got a human face. The problem is he makes a very silly error, and this is where the course gets a bit random, but he invites someone called Tito round. Tito is leader of Yugoslavia, and the Soviets do not like him. So Brezhnev, the Soviet leader, thinks he's being mugged off. He's allowed these reforms to happen, and now they're inviting his enemies round. So the Soviets, just like they do in Hungary, they invade. We get 500,000 tanks, but it's actually a very minor scuffle, only about 80 to 200 deaths, because the Czechoslovakians, unlike the Hungarians, do not fight back. Brezhnev sends a message to the rest of the world and the rest of the satellites saying, if any of you do this again and try to reform, we will intervene, basically saying we will kill you if you try to reform. Heavily increases Soviet control. Once again, America condemn it, but they don't get involved because Czechoslovakia is already communist. Therefore, based on containment, America is not going to get involved. Right, finally then, this leads, after Czechoslovakia and after Cuba, the world calms down a little bit. The 70s are quite a nice time to live during the Cold War. We call it Détente, which means reduced tension. And the 70s are quite chill. Détente is basically the 70s. It begins in 72 with SALT I, and it ends in 79, because that is the end of Détente. So, we have SALT I. It doesn't get rid of weapons, but there is an idea to limit or stop the amount of ABMs and also to freeze the number of submarine ballistic missiles. This is incredibly important because it's the first time the 2 sides have actually started to talk to each other. It shows they are cooperating. It shows they are willing to work together to try to prevent nuclear war. They're a bit scared by the Cuban Missile Crisis still. Then we get the second event. The sides decide to meet alongside other countries in Helsinki. There are 33 plus America and the Soviet Union, so 35 countries meet at Helsinki, and they talk about how they can make the world a safer place. And they agree on human rights, the idea that everyone should have freedom, which is ironic because the Soviets don't give it. They agree on security. For example, East and West Germany finally recognise their borders. and they agree on cooperation, the idea that they're going to actually work together. Everything's looking good. The world is looking up until the Soviets in 79, and we'll come on to this in a second, invade Afghanistan. America is furious about this, and they accuse the Soviets of ignoring Détente and ending Détente. And SALT II is meant to be a really big agreement that bans things like the new ICBMs, but in reality it does nothing because it's never signed. The Congress refuses to ratify it because of Afghanistan. And this sparks what we call the end of Détente and a new Cold War. If you want to call the 70s a relaxing time, the 80s are anything but. They are a very stressful time period. I find the invasion of Afghanistan quite hard to teach, and I've started teaching it like this. I teach it TAK, helps with the leaders. Long story short, the Soviets want Afghanistan for oil reasons, for economic reasons, political reasons, who cares, but they want it. So they put their man in charge, a man called Taraki. He is a pro-Soviet communist. The problem is, Muslims don't like communists because Muslims often believe that in order to have a good life, you have to be very religious, and communism just gives everyone a good life. So the Muslims are unhappy and they kill Taraki, and they put a new guy in charge called Amin, who is obviously not a fan of the Soviets because they've just killed the first guy. Ironically, Amin happened to be educated in America. What a silly world we live in. So the Soviets worry, which is a silly worry, but they worry that America is going to give Amin nuclear weapons or take control of Afghanistan, which is right near the Soviet border. Not true, but the Soviets decide to invade Afghanistan because they want to get rid of Amin and replace him with their own guy, Babrak Karmal, who is once again pro-Soviet. The problem is, the same problem occurs. This guy is still not popular because he's pro-Soviet. So they have to send in troops to defend him from assassination. The Soviet troops stay there for 10 years, and this fully bankrupts the Soviet economy. Gets a little bit tricky here, but there are groups in America called the Mujahideen. In Afghanistan, these are people who want to kill Karmal, the leader. They're essentially a terrorist organization because they want to kill the leader. The USA fund them. So although America and the Soviet Union are not fighting, you have the Russians fighting the Mujahideen, and the Mujahideen is funded by the USA. It's what we call a proxy war. This sparks chaos. Carter comes out and says in the Carter Doctrine, if anyone else invades somewhere in the Middle East, talking to the Soviets, we will invade to protect. Then there are 2 lots of Olympic boycotts, which is so childish, I know. Moscow has the 1980 Olympics, and there are about 61 countries who boycott it. In response, LA has the next Olympics, and 13 Eastern countries boycott it. They refuse to turn up. And it shows that where they were getting on well here, they are no longer getting on well. And if you thought we were arguing now, enter Ronald Reagan. Reagan is a strong anti-communist. He hates the communists. His phrase when he comes to power is, we will win, they will lose. There's a lot of Star Wars people at the time, and he refers to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. Basically says, they're the bad guys, we're the good guys. He comes up with this wacky plan called Star Wars, SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, where they're going to have a laser in outer space that can shoot down the Soviets' nukes. Now, this never happens, but if it does, it would mean that the Cold War would change completely because the Soviet Union could not even bomb America in response. This freaks out the USSR, and they start to panic and start to think there's no point us building new nuclear weapons if we can't even use them. So it reduces the arms race. The Soviet Union almost give up. They're spending all their money in Afghanistan. They've got no money left. What's the point of building more nukes if they can't even use them? And it actually, although Reagan hates the communists, it brings him close together with the leader of the Soviet Union from 85 called Gorbachev. They actually start working together well because Gorbachev realizes he cannot compete with America anymore. The Soviet Union is running out of cash quickly. So Gorbachev needs a new idea. How does he save the Soviet Union from collapse? He calls it his new thinking, and it's very simply 2 policies, glasnost and perestroika. The way I teach people to remember this, because it sounds impossible, glass and restructure. Because glass, when you think of glass, it's see-through, it's open. If you think of a closed society, think of North Korea, they're closed off. If you think of an open society, that means you have more freedom. So glasnost, openness, means more freedom for the satellite states. Freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom to vote. That leads to free elections. Free elections means you can vote to get rid of the communist governments. Perestroika means restructuring or reform. This is where the Soviet economy is failing. So they're going to reform it into a more capitalist economy, meaning they will be able to trade with the West. This is creating competition between businesses. This is what capitalists do, not what communists are supposed to do. So Gorbachev completely changes the Soviet Union. He tries to save it, but it fails miserably. The two, Reagan and Gorbachev, meet a number of times. They meet in a few different conferences: Geneva in 85, Reykjavik 86, Washington 87. The most important one to remember is Washington in 87, because they pass an INF treaty which reduces the number of nukes that both sides will have. And this is incredible. Even though Reagan speaks very badly about the Soviets, even though Reagan, when he came to power, increased spending by 13% on defense. Now he is saying, we've won, basically. The Soviets can't compete with us. So now we'll start to reduce the number of weapons because we know we've won. Remember, Gorbachev promised people free elections. Well, he actually allows it to happen. In 1989, Poland have an election. In Hungary, in 1989, there's an election. In Czechoslovakia, in 1990, there's an election. In Germany, in 1990, there's an election. All of these countries vote to get rid of communism. There's no big war, no big fight. Because of Gorbachev's new thinking, the Soviet control collapses. It starts with the fall of the Berlin Wall, where they tear down the Berlin Wall. When these countries all leave, there is no Eastern countries anymore. In 91, countries like Lithuania, Latvia, all leave as well. Because of that, they call an end to the Warsaw Pact. And by the end of 1991, there is no Soviet Union left. Russia exists, but there is no satellite states, no Eastern Bloc. The capitalist West has won the Cold War. I'm impressed I managed to do this in less than 35 minutes. That was a summary of everything. Every single word on the sheets in front of you is all you need to know for your specification. Please be aware, I've done that in pretty brief detail, so I recommend going back, pausing it, taking notes on stuff you are not sure about. But if you know what all of this stuff means here, gents, you've basically covered the whole of the Cold War. I'm going to do something very similar for the Anglo-Saxons, and I'll get that up. Should be about half an hour long as well. Hopefully you find it useful. If you need anything, you know where we are in history, but this is the toughest paper. You've got to make sure your knowledge is good.